Uh-oh, how unfortunate. Uh-oh, how unfortunate. I'm gonna do a sneaky thing and throw a new contender in the ring. For those of you who don't know that reference, that was the call that Dee Dee, the animatronic, makes in Five Nights at Freddy's Ultimate Custom Night whenever she randomly adds a new enemy to the night that you are currently playing. And it's a sentiment that I wanted to kind of reiterate here, because even though we are continuing on from the story that we were talking about in the last video, if you saw that with the entities, we're now going to start throwing in some new contenders into the ring. Hello and welcome to the Ragnarok Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is the channel where I just take you through some elements of the books that I am writing. As I just alluded to, we are once again going to be talking about these energy-based beings that, simply because they are powerful and weren't immediately rivaled, assumed not only that they were in charge of the multiverse, but also they had the audacity to proclaim themselves as gods. Last time we looked at some of the early history, and at the end of the video I said we would then be jumping forward a little bit to what we're going to talk about today. Not just because I insist upon telling you things out of order, but because the bit that came next, chronologically speaking, that would have required some extra explanatory stuff first, and rather than going and doing a separate video to explain that and then coming back to the entities, I wanted to keep with the entities, just keep this flow up for the second video, so I'm going to jump ahead a little. Again, it shouldn't make too much difference, this should still be fine in and of itself. We're just going to have missed out a little bit, and join them instead when they have found their way within their hexagons to existing in what we would now think of as the Andromeda Galaxy. As we commence this stage of their story, however, I just do want to make it clear that this video, going forward, is going to contain a lot of names and terminology and stuff compared to what videos have come before, and probably compared to what ones are going to come after. As ever, any of the terms that I have made up or things where you may want to just clarify exactly what things are called, as ever you can find those in the description of the video as well, along with spellings and definitions and so forth. Plus, also considering how much terminology this video is going to have, next week's, as kind of to try to maintain some kind of balance and contrast, is going to be something completely different. The first of the videos I suggested way back from the beginning, which would be other topics other than the books, just to mix things up here and there, so just to set out what's about to come forward. So, throughout all of this stage, everything the entities do and any of the other aliens that they come across, this is going to be happening within the fields of hexagons. Because again, as creatures that are originating from the outer region, the entities cannot naturally survive within the reality of the alpha realm. Okay, so bearing that in mind, everything therefore is taking place within a single moment within alpha realm time. The entities coming in with their fleet built by the Ifeiskas, the main flagship at the moment being the Neofa. They are looking for a planet where they can, however briefly, settle, just to sort things out for themselves. The Brethren Lords throughout this will also be popping up here and there to help out, because they are still technically entities, even if they have been given physical form and different roles within the running of the multiverse. But for the most part, they will be remaining within the towers, again, doing that job that they were set to. The planet that the entities do end up settling on first is called Mo Utton. And here they meet a silicon-based race of people called the Apurv. These creatures are approximately 18 feet tall on average. They have 3 digits on each hand and foot. They are bipedal. Their jaws open horizontally rather than vertically. Heads extending out slightly backwards, getting thinner and thinner, then kind of rounding off still. And for the main part of their head, they have this kind of misty protuberance which, despite differences in anatomical structure, basically functions as an eye. It was discovered that the entities could actually possess these individuals based upon the structure of their bodies. They could wear them like suits. Now, the approver didn't mind, because they felt they were helping and it didn't really seem to be doing them any particular harm during or afterwards. So thus, going forwards, the entities now had volunteer physical bodies within which to operate upon these planets and wherever it was else they were visiting. However, when it came to referring to the entities, the approver used the same word that the Ifeiskas did to describe the entities. If we remember, the entities originally saw themselves as above needing any kind of actual classification because they were above everything else. They didn't need to be referred to. They knew exactly who they were. Everyone else would know who they are. But eventually, when they came across the Ifeiskas, those workers labelled them what their word is for entity, just a being, and the entities were okay with this because it was still rather vague about their general existence. However, in the mouths of the approver, this word, phenikotia, it didn't have the same meaning as when the Ifeiskas said it, because the approver weren't speaking the same language, they were just repeating the sounds. So this name, for them, wasn't meaning entity, it was literally a term specifically designed to identify the entities. And the entities didn't like that, because again, they don't think they deserve a name. They weren't going to go through the effort of reintroducing themselves to the approver, but they decided at that point that henceforth, whenever they met another new race, they would first of all find out what that race's word was, like for entity, for a being, so the more vague term, and then introduce themselves using that. So each race or each culture, wherever you've found a difference of language, they would know the entities by their own words that already existed. That's how you end up with them being known in other places by other terms such as the Chiwiwigabwa and the Potsika. Soon it came time for the entities to move on from Mo-Utten, still taking these physical bodies with them. Again, the approver involved still allowing this to be happening, so they went off to explore other areas of what we know to be the Andromeda Galaxy. Of course, because that's the name that we've given to it, it was known by other terms to those that lived in it, or more specifically, the different regions within the galaxies had their own localised names. So as they branched further out into this section of the universe, they found there were two territories within the galaxy which, from the point of view of the timeline in the Alpha Realm, because even though this is all happening within a single moment, technically within one universe, this universe is still designed to having been taking place within a wider history sequence of events. So whenever the entities arrived with their hexagons and basically animated the people that were there once they came within the fields, they were animated already with knowledge supposedly of this history that came before. So from their point of view, in that part of the Alpha Realm timeline, they had recently come into contact with one another and were in the process of coming to some kind of peaceful arrangement, just acknowledging each other's existences. They wouldn't really be involved with one another, just as how the individual worlds that were populated within these regions, they accepted each other, but they didn't have that much to do with each other. So just as part of general policy, they were coming to terms about some agreements that would govern them collectively. You had one region, which was referred to as Nem, and another region, which was referred to as Catel. So, just merging the two names together, the overall territory was now becoming referred to as Nem Catel, and the kind of governing policy around it would be the Nem Catel Co. That being an abbreviation of the word cooperation, which again, they would be saying it in their own languages, but they too were contracting their word for it, so it makes sense to contract it in the English as well. So the Nem Catel Co. This contains some races which you may just come across being name dropped elsewhere casually, such as the Dal, the Ostoil, and the Pri. However, elsewhere within these territories, there was one particular individual that needed to be taken note of, going by the name of Ra. Now, Ra claimed to be coming from a planet that no one else was really aware of, a planet called Heket. But they just decided, in space is a big place, it's fair enough that maybe they just hadn't heard of this planet. They could potentially have argued that maybe the name was referring to a planet they were already aware of, but it was in a language that they hadn't come across from a different part of that planet. But they didn't recognise him as kind of a creature with an identifiable physiology either. They hadn't really come across any other species that had the kind of like beak-like shape to the front of his face. Again, not a beak itself, still like a mouth and nose, but it kind of curves and hooks forwards, like the beak of a bird might do. Now, what Ra was doing is he was gathering individuals whom he would get to work with him in more criminal activities. Originally, he managed to assemble 8 individuals, which collectively were referred to as the Auctor, but over time it was his objective and his success to create a wider criminal organisation referred to as Moravius, which, again, according to him, in his own tongue, literally meant desolation through acquisition of spoils. For the most part, throughout Moravius, every member was equal and contributing in their own way, but he would always have one right-hand person who would have the title of Holfor. This was a position that was sometimes fought over by members of Moravius, wanting to get this closest position to their leader. One such competitor for the role was an individual called Meade, self-proclaimed last of the Valiant Say. The Valiant Say being an ancient order from her own culture, at which she was the last adherent of. Now, Meade was indeed useful to Ra and Moravius, because as part of the abilities of her species, she could go into this kind of chrysalis state and project her consciousness outward into any other kind of surface that existed, and from that surface produce an effigy, like an avatar which she could operate exactly like she would her normal person. However, again, it was remote, although the distance over which she could project herself was limited to an extent, or again, it's all relative, and also it would be subject to any of the potential weaknesses of the substance that she was made of, or in turn strength. So if she was made of metal, she's potentially going to be stronger. If it was a material like wood, there's a risk that she'd be slightly more fragile. You could, if you wanted to, refer to these kind of effigies by the term wood, but she personally always disapproved of that because she felt to give the effigies their own name was to consider them their own distinct thing, rather than an extension of her own person, that they weren't one whole life form. Now, as I say, among the activities that the group Moravius did is generally sowing discord. On a more psychological level, on a social scale, they tried to destabilise the general sense of cohesion between the Nem Ketel Co by surely suggesting to some people that actually, well, why should the Nem name of the territory go first? Why shouldn't it actually be Ketel Nem? And then also, what's the point of using the contraction for cooperation? Wouldn't it make more sense to say the Ketel-Nem Alliance? So just generally putting it into the public perception that they should actually be called this other thing instead, and was one more subtle way of just trying to destabilise things. Then actually in what's more explicit criminal action, they would be performing thefts and damages and so forth, heists, with the help sometimes of a technology that was provided to them actually by one of the Brethren Lords, Lord Upre. Because again, the Lords, as I said at the beginning, were generally around during all of this, although again, usually they're in their towers with a pop-by here and there. But they weren't always explicitly we're definitely going to be helping the entities. They would interact with any of the races they came across. So when they came across Moravius, sure, they provided them with this new technology, a technology referred to as Hika, which is basically a form of nanotechnology. Whereas I've already talked about nanites and stuff in the Calot video with the genies, which, as I specified at that time, I was kind of ambiguous about that, as in what they actually are. But here explicitly is nanotechnology, one which can be used at an extensive scale to essentially either break down other objects or to take other existing matter and pull them apart and reassemble them in a new way. So again, this was just one tool that was provided to them on a technological level, which helped them pull off these kinds of escapades. And then anything that they had stolen, treasures and anything of value, for instance, they would then go off somewhere else, maybe even as far as the Milky Way sometimes, to make sure it remained safe. Maybe sometimes to a planet that would come to be called Earth, or to a country that would come to be called Egypt, to hide their stuff in a place that would come to be referred to as the Galgavar outpost. Elsewise, back in the Andromeda Galaxy, you also had a group referred to as the Root Triumvirate. Now, the Root were a shape-shifting species. In general, all of them were able to reform their generally amorphous beings into the appearance of anyone or anything else, within reason, again, considering conservation of mass. But the more skilled among them in turn could even do so in such a way that they took on every single precise property of that person or thing. that they were mimicking as well. Now, over the many generations, many generations the Root had been in existence, they have ended up actually losing their original form. There is now no actual Root being. Instead, all they ever have is whatever the latest guise they are currently taking. And even when they're born, they usually just take the form, or they inherit the form of whatever the parent was in, whether it was two roots that had reproduced or they had reproduced with a mate of a given species. One of the members of the Root Triumvirate, an individual by the name of Nuit-Haugar, it was his job to keep track of all of the Root out there across these various populated planets. Ra was interested in Nuit, therefore, because if he could get him to divulge the identities and locations of all these people, he could potentially start approaching them to get shapeshifters onto his side from Aurovisp, to make it even easier to pull off these kind of crimes, and would open up new avenues, even more diverse kind of actions he could get them to perform. Nuit wasn't really sure what to do. He wasn't completely against the idea. He wasn't sure whether he should, whether he shouldn't. And while he was being indecisive, he was discovered by another member of the Triumvirate. He was discovered interacting with Ra, and from that point, he felt he couldn't return. He was in danger. He was about to face some form of judicial punishment for interacting with this criminal organisation, this criminal leader, and therefore he flung himself at the mercy of Ra, the other authority figure that he felt potentially would be sympathetic towards him, given that they'd already been interacting. And so desperate was Nuit so suddenly that he basically ended up being in the position of being the one to do all of Aurovisp's manual labour, as well as doing the tasks that were specifically kind of designed for a shapeshifter. They would just get him to do whatever it was that they didn't personally want to do, all of the cheap stuff, because he would agree to do it, because he needed their sanctuary, at least as he did in his own perception. Now, following this point, word got out throughout the different planets and systems that Aurovisp now did have at least one Root working for them, and so general suspicion of whether anyone around them was that Root working for Aurovisp spread everywhere. There was general panic and suspicion, and you ended up also with some people starting to develop machines and weapons that would either try to expose a given Root or would even only harm them. They would only be harmful to something which ultimately is of this more amorphous nature deep down on a genetic level. The entities agreed to help the governing bodies of those given regions, a governing body called Ma'ot. They agreed to help them ban the development of these kind of weapons and these kind of machines because, of course, they would be harmful against all of the other completely innocent Roots that were also already living happily within these different societies. Yet while the entities were happy to kind of prohibit and help the banning of anything that would hurt innocents, they didn't really have any qualms against weapons and the like that would explicitly be used against those who were guilty, for instance, such as Aurovisp. Now, turning our attention back to Ra. Ra could have left at this point. Again, Aurovisp were already kind of going back and forth in and out of these regions of the galaxy to hide their acquisitions. He could have left once it became clear that the entities were helping to try to track them down and deal with them. However, he found the entities fascinating, recognising them for what they potentially were in regards to the rest of existence. So he did stay behind, potentially in his own hubris, thinking that he would be fine to observe them. And meanwhile, he was also working on his own developmental technologies. Such a technology was actually then discovered, however, by another race passing through called the Palantir. Now, I've mentioned the Palantir before in the video about different kinds of space travel. They were the ones who pioneered the usage of the subspace conduits. And they will have another video down the line, at least one, talking about them in more explicit detail, because they do end up being important to the overall general conflict happening in the background of the series. But kind of in short, right now, they behave as a kind of intergalactic justice system, already having their own kind of hexagon-based technology. They too are already able to move about on their own within the particular universes, so in this case this one, and they're using the subspace conduits to try to track down a specific group already in particular, but as they go along their way, if they come across anyone else who they feel needs their help, they will do what they can to make sure that the general net good and innocence of reality is maintained. Now, that being said, while they are kind of champions for what is right, they aren't necessarily always morally good themselves. They're more of the attitude that they will ensure that the overall level of good is assured by whatever means are necessary. So when they found this technology being developed by Ra, they took it upon themselves to kind of develop it in their own way, and thus ended up creating this satellite array, which had the capability of, if it had a target, be it a person or a ship or whatever, to break it down into its constituent atoms, and then scatter those atoms across space or the given environment, completely destroying whatever it was after. And they're going to use this to get rid of Merovius, because again, they are the nuisance, they are the scourge of this territory of space. The entities, even though they know about the development of this satellite array, they don't bother to try to stop this one, because again, it will explicitly be used against Merovius, and they don't care about that because Merovius are guilty. They are the bad guys. Now, Ra is not going to admit to anyone that he's actually accidentally allowed some of his own work to start to be developed into a weapon that will be used against them. So instead, he now makes sure that Merovius is focused on another task, the stealing of a new ship that's being developed by the Nemcatel Co. So again, despite all of the chaos that's been going on, the governing body still want to kind of mark the union of the different systems' territories with the reveal of this new ship called the Chariot, which is designed to be piloted by a representative of each of the main species from within the Alliance. The ship itself kind of has a crescent-shaped main body with then a small thin bridge sticking out from the middle of the inside of the curve. And within this bridge, you have a station again for each of these representatives. Each of the stations themselves have optional controls that are compatible for any of the given races. Any of them could stand anywhere in particular. And then, whether it's all of them there at once or it's just a few of them, whatever, the ship is designed that they would all be piloting it simultaneously. And while usually this wouldn't necessarily be the most efficient way to go about things, it's part of symbolically marking that these races are now all working together. The ship only works properly if they all successfully pilot it in unison. Now, Merovius began at the reveal of the ship. They managed to steal it and fly it away. However, in the process, one of their members does end up being captured by the Palanthea. And they are able to then take this member of Merovius, basically chain them at the heart of the satellite array, and thus in that position, the systems can use access to their mind to control the targeting system to then go after the different members of Merovius. Soon realising what was happening, the majority of the members of Merovius scattered. They left the Chariot to try to hide on their own, to not be associated with it. That being said, Mirdi did stay behind to keep on piloting it, because they didn't want to lose their prize, and she, first of all, took the ship to the planet upon which Merovius had on occasion been rendezvousing with the Brethren Lords, because again they had relations in the past, Mirdi being one of the people acting as a liaison. The Lords did express some level of sympathy for their situation, but because of the involvement of the entities, they refused to properly act in any capacity, so Mirdi again took the Chariot and fled off even further away into space. Meanwhile, for those who had, let's say, fled the Chariot to try to survive on their own, those members of Merovius, for them, there thus came the event that would be known as the Reckoning of Nuartum Benel, where swiftly and mercilessly the Palanthea's satellite array would, one by one or in groups, atomize each of them out of immediate existence. Now, they didn't entirely kill them per se. Their consciousnesses still lingered, however what had happened is that they had been kind of moved over into what is referred to as hypospace. So if you want to think of more traditional hyperspace as being some plane within which you could travel, from your perspective, a short distance in hyperspace, but then when you enter normal space again, you've now travelled a lot further. That's some interpretations of how hyperspace could get you over massive distances. Hypospace is then the opposite. It's a plane within which you could travel for great distances, but then if you were to return to kind of regular reality, you wouldn't have gone anywhere near as far. Now, in other books and other parts of the multiverse, this will be used in different ways. For instance, hypospace is actually the plane where you get the richest deposits of Xiang, that what we would call dark matter that has relevance, again, has been discussed in previous videos. It also is used by other races, sometimes as a means of accelerating over a shorter distance. So if you need to suddenly be travelling very quickly, if you transfer your vehicle into hypospace, you can travel further there, accelerating greater, shift back into regular reality, and now you've travelled only a shorter distance, but you're already moving at a much greater speed, which you already need to have achieved. Alternatively, it may be used as some kind of, like, again, containment for certain things, or for storage. Because again, if you have less room in the main plane of reality, if you were to put some of whatever you're storing into hypospace, it's now, I guess, kind of like the TARDIS in Doctor Who is bigger on the inside. You have more room to put stuff in. But of course you then have to be careful about how you bring it all back out. You couldn't do it all at once, or otherwise you've now got all of that material now suddenly trying to fit into a smaller, restricted space again. But yes, that's where all of their consciousnesses ended up, including Ra's. There was one individual that had different circumstances, however, and that was Nuit Halgar. Because as a root, as a shapeshifter, this amorphous being, he didn't have strict atoms to be broken down into, because again, it's not just like separating out all the atoms together. The machine would take all of your carbon atoms and put them over here. It would take all of your sodium atoms and put them over here. But the roots didn't have specific atoms in that way. They kept on changing. So instead, when the satellite array struck him, he was shunted into a mirror dimension, which is a whole other thing entirely. Again, I'll need to do another video down the line where I explain all of, again, because there's a number of different these other planes. Like, you've got hypospace, you've got subspace, you've got the mirror dimension, whatever. We'll discuss how you could use four-dimensional space to have like adjacent 3D planes, and therefore how you can have areas that are dimensionally heavy and what the consequence of that is. But again, that's stuff for another day. That's just where Nuit ended up, slightly different to everyone else, when still with his entire body intact. With them all gone, the last one for the satellite to track down was Mirdi in the chariot. Now, she had already been able to evade other people who had gone after her so far. For instance, she had been able to remotely tamper with some of their hexagons. Remember, this is all happening inside of hexagons, inside like the mobile bubbles of outer region reality, keeping you active within this one moment, within this one universe in the Alpha Realm. So she would have it where, if say you got a ship pursuing her, part of the hexagon's field around part of the ship would fail, therefore that section of the ship would suddenly freeze and become part of the static universe. The rest of the ship is still trying to move mobily and it would tear itself apart. However, again, the satellite array still managed to track her down and pursue her no matter how far she tried to travel. Although she did keep on managing to evade it. Eventually, she tried to get the upper hand by trying to lure it into a black hole. The manoeuvre worked to an extent. The satellite array did get caught in the black hole's influence, but so did she with the chariot. And so both became... They didn't obviously fly straight into the event horizon itself, and either way that would take a long time, given time distortions. They were more kind of skirting around the edge of the accretion disk. Still, though, point is, they kind of got caught like a message in a bottle kind of situation, where they got trapped there and preserved very slowly in a temporal distortion, getting closer and closer towards the black hole. So the Planetary had lost their satellite array, but they had succeeded. They had, from all intents and purposes, dispensed with the entirety of Morovius. They wouldn't go on to develop this kind of technology again, for just as how Ra didn't want it getting out that it's his work that had led to what was going to wipe out Morovius, the Planetary in turn didn't want to risk unnecessarily it being found out that they had got the designs for that technology from Ra, the head of Morovius. For even though they wiped out that group, they still didn't want to risk any damage to their own reputation by being associated with him after the fact. Following this then, the reckoning of Nuart and Benel, things rather quietened down again, with Moravius having gone, as the kind of relations between the different systems in the Alliance kind of kept on running smoothly henceforth. Eventually it got to the point where the entities would once again move on, again still possessing these bodies of the Approve, who again still were volunteering, but just don't forget they were still technically in these bodies, still inhabiting them. There were a couple of other places they would go and other races they would meet. For instance, there was one travelling race called the Sganji, who were setting up temples on certain planets that they thought were viable for their own purposes later on. So these temples were beacons in them, so they'd know where to come back to afterwards. By this point, the entities had the archway technology that I mentioned again in the video about the different kind of space travel, where you would use pulses that were kind of attuned to the fabric of reality to travel from an archway to somewhere else. So they said, well, here, if we'll give you this archway technology, if you put these in your temples, it will make it easier for you to travel between them or wherever you want to go. But other than these kind of other odd interactions, it was getting to the point where not only had the entities wanted to move on from where they were, a number of them were wanting to return back home to the outer region, to the cortex, where again they felt they were meant to be in charge. Having had this excursion exploring the Alpha Realm, again the reason for coming out here in the first place is part of that period that I kind of skipped over, that I'll talk about another time. So it was time now to return. Not all of them agreed. Some of them instead actually felt that no, it's actually better living among the other races, the other denizens of the multiverse, because they still felt they were in charge of the multiverse, but it was better to live among their denizens in the Alpha Realm, albeit if it's only within one moment, and everything has to remain within the Hexagon fields. Thus, the entities split off into two factions. You had the Ivilti, who went off back into the outer region, and otherwise you had the Blorka, who stayed behind. With the main ships, such as the Njorfa I named at the beginning, going off with the group that were heading back into the outer region, those who were staying behind, the Blorka, they built some new ships of their own, completely new designs. These ones would be fueled by draining the energy from the cores of planets. They would only ever do this to planets that were never going to have life on them anyway. Basically, they would drill down, in a less rudimentary sense, to the core of that planet and siphon off all of the energy that was going off within the iron cores, or whatever it was the planet had, and they'd use that to propel their ships from place to place to place. Eventually, some of them in turn wanted to settle down. They constructed for themselves not exactly a version of the cortex, but some other hub within which they could live. They called it the Olfane. However, other races that would hear tell of this thing, they would simply instead think of it as the entity's citadel in the Alpha Realm. And those that lived there, they were referred to as the Yog-Siltha, and they built other workers for themselves, like originally the entities that had the Ifeiskas. So this group now built some purely robotic workforce referred to as the Dox-Siltha. And from in terms of accounting the events, that's where I'm going to draw it to a halt today. So across that, those various events, those various groups, they would go on to, thanks to glimpses into this wider reality from a human perspective, inspire certain aspects within at least 3 of our earthly mythologies. But this, of course, they would never know. As I said previously, this was a very terminology-heavy episode, talking about all different races and so forth. Next week we'll be taking a definite break from that. But either way, I hope you have found this interesting, as ever, as you may do with other videos on the channel. And until I see you again, just remember to keep on telling stories.